Welcome, everybody. I see we have some attendees coming in. We're going to get started in exactly 1 minute. We'll give people a moment to enter. Great. We're going to get started now. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Aisha Mara. I am part of the Legal Aid Society's development team. A few housekeeping points before beginning. Today's briefing is being recorded. The chat feature for the webinar is disabled, but you can submit a question at any time using the Q&A function in your Zoom tool. Questions will be answered during the Q&A session at the end of the discussion. To kick off the event, I am pleased to invite the Attorney-in-Chief of the Legal Aid Society's Criminal Defense Practice, Tina Luongo, to provide some context on why the fight for trans plus rights is so vital to the Legal Aid Society. Tina has served as our attorney in charge of the criminal defense practice since 2014, where they are responsible for the daily operation of all of the practice's trial, appellate, post-conviction, law reform, and parole defense work conducted on behalf of all over 200,000 clients. In addition to being a lifelong advocate for decarceration, Tina has been a relentless activist throughout the current Rikers crisis. Thanks for joining us today, Tina.
Sorry, I should have unmuted. I'm Tina Luongo. As Aisha said, I am the attorney in charge of the criminal defense practice. And welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining this discussion with some of the experts that are leading in not only the decarceration movement, but also in a movement that elevates the inhumane and life-threatening treatment of the trans community throughout the criminal legal system and beyond. The reality, as many of you know from the media and from working either with us here at Legal Aid or in partnership with us at the Legal Aid Society, right now we are facing an unprecedented crisis at Rikers and the Department of Correction facilities. In particular, this is landing hard on the trans plus community. Through the work you're going to hear today and our over 40 years of experience, you're going to hear about how we at the Legal Aid Society, through the partnership with many, many others, particularly those who are most impacted by what is happening at Rikers in our jails. You'll hear about our efforts. Not only what I'd like to say is our litigation, our mitigation, our advocacy, and our protest efforts. And that's a critically important piece to recognize that this is a holistic approach and one that is not just about today, but must be looking toward the future. I can't talk about this work without actually recognizing Judy Yu, who is here today to moderate this panel. Judy is a leader in the LGBTQ plus space for years upon years, and will be moderating this discussion. From her perspective, currently as the Senior Program Officer in the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity and Expression, SOGIE program at Wellspring Philanthropic Fund. Also, Judy comes from, prior to that, from working with, as the Director of Juvenile Justice at the Juvenile Justice Project of Correction Association in New York. So is well-versed in the issues that were very present and are present now in the lives of people who are incarcerated. She also served as the the Director of Programs at APEX, an Asian American youth organizer in New York City. So at the front line of the fight that happens in our advocacy communities, and the Associate Director of the Youth Programs in the New York City LGBT Community Center. Among her many, many affiliations, Judy was a member of the Equity Project Advisory Committee that was formed to ensure that LGBT youth and juvenile delinquency courts are treated with dignity, respect, and fairness. Judy currently serves on the board of directors of Funders for LGBTQ Issues. And in her role at Wellspring, Judy has created the opportunity right here at Legal Aid Society many years ago to form our LGBT Law and Policy Unit. I can't say enough about Judy and her commitment to this work, and so really happy to see her moderating this panel. Hi, Judy, and take it away.
Hi, Tina. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and hello to everyone. I am really honored to be moderating a conversation among the brilliant staff of the Legal Aid Society. I have firsthand knowledge of their dedication and really the cutting edge work from when I was an advocate, as Tina referenced, and worked closely with them on many of these issues. And, you know, I really just have to further say about Legal Aid Society that although Legal Aid Society is a New York based organization, they were really one of the first in the country to address and bring attention to the disproportionate representation of LGBTQ+ youth in the justice system, and have always really been a fierce advocate for all LGBTQ+ communities and those most marginalized through their litigation, their advocacy, public education, the holistic approach that Tina was referencing. So it's a real honor to be part of this conversation and to mark the Trans Day of Remembrance, which is on November 20th, but to mark this week leading up to that day with all of you and with the Legal Aid Society. And to also just make a note that who are we talking about and focusing on today? And so we are going to hear the acronym TGNC NBI a lot during this conversation. And when we use this acronym, we are referring to transgender, gender nonconforming, non-binary, and intersex people. So that is, as you all know, the focus of today's conversation. It's the focus of the Trans Day of Remembrance. And so why is this important, and why is there a Trans Day of Remembrance? Unfortunately, 2021 has been the deadliest year on record for TGNC NBI people. There have been, as of today, I think 46 people who are TGNC NBI who were murdered. And this is a record each year. When we speak of the Trans Day of Remembrance, each year it ends up being the worst year on record. So this is the violence is increasing and escalating, and it doesn't even capture the many deaths that go unreported. I also just want to note, since we're talking about New York State in particular, that data has also showed that between 2017 and 2020, New York State has actually one of the highest numbers of TGNC NBI murders in this country. So the statistics are grim, but they actually don't even fully capture the violence and the mistreatment that TGNC NBI people face in multiple realms of life. And I think most importantly, the violence of the criminal legal system against TGNC NBI folks, particularly Black trans people who are disproportionately impacted. And these are some of the reasons why Wellspring SOGIE program prioritizes supporting and funding work that really addresses this lethal intersection of transphobia, racism, misogyny, through this criminalization of LGBTQ+ people, especially TGNC NBI people of color. And we know, and I think we're very aligned with Legal Aid Society in believing that liberation and equity for LGBTQ+ people, we can't achieve that without really centering those most marginalized, which is TGNC NBI people, especially Black TGNC NBI people. And that in order to transform the criminal legal system in New York and in other jurisdictions, we also must center this community of TGNC NBI Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So I'm really excited to dive deeper into how Legal Aid Society is doing this work, how they're fighting such criminalization, how they're fighting for the rights of the TGNC MBI community, and really of all New Yorkers pushed to the margins. And so I want to get us started, and I want to turn it over actually to Erin, Beth, Harrist, and Jasmina Chuck from the LGBTQ plus Law and Policy Unit to introduce themselves and to say a little bit more about what their unit does and the role they play in this work.
Thank you so much, Judy. A pleasure to have you here today. My name is Erin Beth Harrist, and I use she and they pronouns, and I'm the supervising attorney with the LGBTQ plus unit. This unit does kind of twofold things, I like to think. We do internally facing work. We work hard to train all of the 2,000 members of legal aid staff on how to support and affirm LGBTQ plus clients. And as part of that, and very relevant to this discussion, that involves making sure that our clients that are working their way through the criminal law system, at arraignments, potentially going to Rikers, are we making sure that we're taking the steps necessary to get them into the safest possible housing, to make sure that their gender identity is respected, to make sure that they're getting the medical care that they need while they're inside. So that's some of the kind of work that we're doing internally. Externally, we do policy, legislative, and impact litigation work with the goal of advancing LGBTQ liberation. And we're working quite a bit on looking at particularly the state prison system and the way that it treats and the way that it is horribly unfair and discriminatory to the TGNC NBI community. We're working on those efforts, and we'll speak a little bit about that further on. But I want to turn it over to my amazing colleague, Jasmina Chuck, to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. I am Jasmina Chuck. I use she, they pronouns. I'm the paralegal 2 for the LGBTQ plus Law and Policy Unit at Legal Aid. It's been my pleasure to work with the unit for the past 9 years and to see the work really evolve to reflect the many issues and the many ways in which our clients are funneled into the systems that we're working with and rendered impoverished and rendered in need of their services. So I have the particular joy of really supporting our client population, working on connecting to community, working on connecting folks with community organizations. I've been part of a number of re-entry efforts in the recent times because the bulk of the work that we've needed to focus on, especially during COVID, has been supporting folks in carceral settings. So really addressing those gaps, looking at issues, trying to figure out how to support folks when they're released and how to prevent recidivism is some of the large things that we've been focused on, especially in light of COVID, which exacerbated many issues for our clients. I'll turn it back to you, Judy.
Great, thank you both. And now I have the pleasure of having Mik Kinkead and Sophie Gebreselassie of the Reentry Project at Legal Aid Society, the Prisoners and the Prisoners' Rights Project, talk about their work unit and themselves.
Hi, I'm Mik Kinkead. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the staff attorney for the Rikers Island Reentry Project. And up until the pandemic, until about March 17th, 2020, I was on Rikers Island twice a week, meeting directly with our clients, as well as conducting Know Your Rights trainings and groups in what's called the Special Consideration Unit, which is a unit for trans, non-binary, and intersex people within RMSC, Rose M. Singer. So twice a week I would go, once a week I would go to that unit, and then on the alternate weeks I would go to the unit that they had set aside for trans people in what they refer to as general population. So I have a lot of intimate knowledge about all these systems, and unfortunately got to see lots of people come through many times, as well as form some deep connections with people. I'm also serving on the task force of the city council task force on trans or non-conforming, intersex, and non-binary people within Rikers. So the idea being that we would get to provide feedback and alter how the city responds to these issues. And so, you know, to the extent that I can talk about what government input has been in on all of this, I'm happy to do so and delighted to be part of this conversation.
Sophie, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't tell whether you could see me. Sorry about that. So my name is Sophie Gebreselassie, and I'm a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society's Prisoners' Rights Project. The Prisoners' Rights Project was established in 1971 in the wake of the Attica and Tombs uprisings. And the project works to challenge unconstitutional conditions in both New York City jails and also New York State prisons. The project uses litigation, policy advocacy, regulatory advocacy, and legislative advocacy, as well as community organizing and the different tools that Tina mentioned. My work at the Prisoners' Rights Project focuses primarily on state prison conditions. And over the past nearly 2 years now that I've been with the project, I've had the pleasure to work closely with Jas, Mik, and Erin, who are really leaders in the field of TGNC NBI rights specifically. So I'm very happy to be here, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for that brief introduction of your brilliance and your brilliant work. So I wanted to start us off. I know Tina had referenced the crisis at Rikers, and I think many of us have seen this in the news. And I wanted to talk specifically with you all about the impact of the announced closure of Rose M. Singer Center, also known as Rosie's. So I had a question to start us off for you, Erin. The governor and mayor announced a month ago that they would be closing Rosie's, which is the only women's jail, designated women's jail at Rikers, and that they were going to transfer everyone to Bedford Hills, which is a state prison that's designated for women. Can you explain the status of that transfer for us right now?
Absolutely. I think it's really important to note, this announcement came a month ago. It really came out of the blue. Stakeholders were not consulted. And I think it's important to refer back to what Mik was talking about, that there's actually a committee that was created by the city council to advise on TGNC NBI issues at Rikers. And they were not consulted at all in regards to this closure of Rosie's and movement of trans people from that facility to Bedford Hills, which is a maximum security state prison in Westchester. There was a lot of pushback. There is still a lot of pushback about these transfers. There's a lot of issues that apply to everyone that's being transferred, and that includes very serious access to counsel issues that are still being worked out, even though those transfers have started. They started a couple weeks ago. They are continuing to go on. I believe that their goal is that all of the transfers will be completed in about a month, at which point they are quote unquote closing Rosie's. I will say, as to the TGNC NBI community at Rosie's, that they are, we believe, or we've been told, have a choice as to whether they go to Bedford Hills or not. Of course, we are skeptical as to how true that actually is and are monitoring that. But at this point in time, that is our understanding of how the transfers are working, and they have in fact begun.
Thank you, Erin. So understandable skepticism about whether or not TGNC NBI people will really have any options, but let's keep that in mind. And I'm just curious, Mik, if you can talk about the impact on TGNC NBI people in city custody.
Yeah, absolutely. So like Erin said, I'm on city council. It includes members of the Department of Corrections, Correctional Health Services, the Board of Corrections, and then a lot of trans-identified activists, either from organizations or just in their individual capacity. And even though obviously the department and Correctional Health Services and to some extent the board must have known about this, we were not told at all. So none of us who were appointed to the city council as experts, either in legal or cultural or medical care, weren't consulted. And so that led to things like the first headlines coming out, which said all women, all trans people to be transferred. And so any one of us on that city council panel could have told the governor's office that that's not true. Not all trans people are at Rose, and not all women are at Rose. And so that's just like two blatantly false statements to sort of lead off this transfer with. And if that's the way you begin a project, understandably, the most impacted people are going to be very, very skeptical of that project. So at this time, as Erin said, we do know that the transfers have begun. We know a number of cis women have gone upstate. And we also know that there was a small number of trans men who've gone upstate too. And then this is counter to what we were told as well. We were told that trans, non-binary, and intersex people would be the last people to go upstate, so they would have sufficient time to meet with council and be informed about the difference between being in the city Department of Corrections custody versus the state Department of Corrections and Community Supervision custody. Because once they leave the city and they go up to Bedford Hills, New York, they're under someone else's jurisdiction. And that is true for commissary, that's true for disciplinary actions, that is true for just in general how people interact, officers to medical staff to people who are incarcerated, people incarcerated to officers. The whole culture is different. And we have been told that folks will have about 5 to 6 weeks to meet with everyone and get all the information. We found out last week, I think, on Wednesday night, that wasn't true when I looked at a list of people and I identified there were 2 trans men on that list. And I was like, well, these are 2 trans men. What are they doing on this list? So it's really because we're working as a collaborative that, so much of legal aid's criminal defense practice, so much of the LGBT plus unit, along with all these other organizations, are sharing whatever it is that we know with each other so that we can best defend our clients. And because of that, in this specific example, we were able to ensure that one of the trans men who did not want to go up to Bedford Hills was taken off the list. And the other man did want to go to Bedford Hills, so he did go up. But we made sure that they actually had a meaningful conversation with him about his rights, that he could have said no. And also to clarify some of the really horrible rumors that are flying around. I went with clients for most of 2 weeks ago. I went up to meet with people, and trans women at Rose were being told that they would go to men's facilities if they refused to go to Bedford Hills. Trans men were also being told they would go to men's facilities if they refused. And then a lot of folks just didn't know any information as to what their rights would be, how they would talk to their attorneys. We have a lot of clients who are non-citizens who weren't told about what their rights would be, and because it's a different system in terms of interacting with ICE as well. So the impact is enormous, and it's been really devastating for this community in particular because of the lack of clarity and the lack of information. Because the folks who are making these decisions say things like all women, all trans people, without that being the fact, the truth, and not talking to the experts on the matter. And so it's been devastating to all people, but in this particular way, to trans, non-binary, and intersex people, it has just been a very pointed lack of care and lack of concern for their safety in terms of housing, their continuity of care in terms of medical care, access to counsel, and just having meaningful conversations with informed advocates or informed DOC officers, because at every turn they're getting told something completely different. Yeah, I mean, that's just the beginning of that. And I will just add as an aside, one additional thing that has been an issue is that all these trans women who we are working with in men's jails currently, until last week, it was very unclear what we should be doing on their behalfs, because we were advocating for them to go to Rose M. Singer, but if Rose M. Singer doesn't exist, then where do we advocate for them to go, and whose system do we use, whose criterion? And neither docs nor DOC have published criterion, so it's all sort of a guessing game. And only this week, actually, or last week, we were told finally that we should continue to advocate for trans women to go to Rose, and then after they got to Rose, they could then go to Bedford Hills. But again, that's 2 moves on a person who's already exhausted and fighting their criminal case.
Thank you, Mik, for that very sobering and clear portrait of the real lack of transparency and callous indifference in terms of how this is being announced and implemented. I'm wanting us to move along a little bit just because in terms of time. So I just wanted to give a chance for Sophie to also jump in if you wanted to, before we move to the next section, talk a little bit if there's any other implications that you all are wrestling with in this announcement about trans people potentially being housed at Bedford Hills and being in state custody as opposed to city custody. And then I'd like to move us to the next section. But Sophie, I wanted to just give you a chance to jump in if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And that actually segues nicely into the legal protections that are and are not available to folks in custody and how that plays out in the city and the state. I would just to add to everything that Mik was saying, one of the concerns about this population of folks moving up into the state is because they may not have the same resources and rights that have been hard won in the city, especially with regard to gender-aligned housing and medical care in the state. So that is one concern about making sure that there's some continuity of that care. And so to jump to the legal protections that are available to trans plus individuals in New York, New York State and New York City through its human rights law have some of the most strongest protections for TPNC NBI people in the country. For example, in 2019, the New York State Human Rights Law was amended through the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act, GENDA, to explicitly add gender identity or expression to the list of protected categories under which discrimination on that basis would be prohibited under the human rights law. And this is a big deal, especially that today only 22 states and the District of Columbia prohibit explicitly discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity in their civil or human rights laws. It is important to note, though, that this bill was introduced in 2013 and passed the Assembly every year from 2008 until it was finally put up for a floor vote in 2019 and passed. But still, it does provide protections for this group of individuals. The issue, though, with the New York State Human Rights Law, Civil Rights Law, and New York City Human Rights Law is that the state and city have interpreted these laws to not apply in prisons. So these laws prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity in public accommodations, for example. And prisons, the state has argued that prisons do not count as public accommodations, thereby making those protections, in their view, unavailable to people in their custody. Another law is that the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which was passed in 2003 and works to prevent sex abuse in carceral settings. And under PREA, which has a series of associated guidelines, there are protections for trans plus people in custody. For example, in terms of housing, PREA prohibits housing based solely on one's external genitalia, and instead, prisons under PREA are supposed to make a case-by-case determination, taking into account that individual's safety, their view of safety, operation of the prison, to determine whether or not to grant that person gender-aligned housing. The problem is that that allows for a lot of discretion. And so it really should be viewed as a floor rather than an operational ceiling. For those individuals for whom, let's say, for example, that they are not housed in a carceral setting according to gender identity, of course, there are constitutional protections they can turn to, but the path forward is not always completely clear. So we believe, of course, that transgender individuals who are treated differently than similarly situated cis individuals are being discriminated against the Equal Protection Clause. This is very salient in the context of housing. Oftentimes, prisons around the country will argue that they cannot house a transgender woman in a women's facility because of perhaps her criminal history, perhaps her disciplinary history in custody. And we believe that is discrimination under the Equal Protection Clause because a similarly situated cis woman who has a very violent crime or a terrible disciplinary history in custody is not then prohibited from being housed in a women's prison. Of course, under the Equal Protection Clause, the question that always comes down to is the level of scrutiny that you're applying to the given class of people. While the Supreme Court has not clearly weighed in on that question, in a case called Bostock, 2020 case called Bostock, the court did hold that transgender status, as they put it, was the discrimination on the basis of transgender status was discrimination on the basis of sex under Title VII. And a lot of courts have then taken that and used that to then say, okay, then discrimination against transgender people is the same as discrimination against people on the basis of sex for the purposes of equal protection and applied heightened scrutiny. So that's a very encouraging line of cases that can help in the housing context. I'll quickly just reference the 8th Amendment and how for individuals who are not housed according to gender identity, how they can find some reprieve in the 8th Amendment. Of course, the 8th Amendment, so of course, prison officials can be found to violate the 8th Amendment when they show deliberate indifference to the health or safety of an individual in their custody. And in order to make that showing of deliberate indifference, one must show that the official knew or disregarded an excessive risk to the individual's health or safety. It is clear to all of us on this panel, of course, and many people that just by nature of being TGNC-MBI in custody, you are at great risk for abuse of many forms from other incarcerated individuals, from staff. Unfortunately, often courts will not take that blanket generalized risk as sufficient to show awareness. So oftentimes, it's very sad. In fact, many people will have to reference the abuses that they've suffered previously and prison's awarenesses of it to make a strong claim. So it is an evolving area of law, a lot of positive developments, and there's a lot of opportunity for really positive jurisprudence in the future. And it's been very exciting being at the Legal Aid Society, where we're pushing to, in all of these places where there may be certain ambiguities in the law, get the court to come down on the right side.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for that really comprehensive overview around a really complicated landscape and patchwork of laws and legal protections, and also the disconnect between the existence of laws and the failure to actually implement them in their truest sense, and ways in which they're not accessible to some of the most vulnerable folks. And I wanted to actually really focus in on that and to turn to Jazz to talk a little bit about why TGNC MBI people are often targeted by the criminal law system, and how laws are used against this community. And can you talk a little bit about that? And then I also would love to hear a little bit, get us to a part around Erin, if you can come in and just talk about then what's needed to address this crisis we're hearing about. But let's start first with Jazz for taking us through the criminal legal system and its impact on TGNC MBI folks.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you, Sophie. And I also want to invite Mik, because we definitely work very closely on these issues as well. Very complex system. I think in general, there are laws. We specifically at Legal Aid have filed many impact litigation lawsuits to look directly at laws and policies that themselves are biased or transphobic, that are being used to the discretion of individuals in the police enforcement and law enforcement and various other ways to target specifically transgender, gender variant, gender expansive folks, and specifically Black, Indigenous people of color in specific zip codes and areas. And we can really monitor and kind of see this playing out in when certain arrests are happening in what areas, and other areas where there aren't any arrests. For example, with the Walking While Trans ban and bill, thank goodness, it was a huge effort on behalf of so many people in New York, amazing trans organizations, grassroots organizations, advocates who have been pushing against this vague law being used specifically to round up trans women specifically in vans, right? To just take them off of the street because of prejudice and discrimination in those specific areas and zip codes. So being able to see trends and patterns in where folks are being arrested for behavior and where folks aren't. So that's one way that we're able to kind of really highlight those issues that are happening. Because Legal Aid is so large, we have amazing direct frontline staff in every borough. So we are able to communicate with each other and start to see those patterns. So vague laws that are used, giving a lot of discretion to folks, laws that don't require a lot of, because evidence is a tough word, but don't require a lot of evidence or proof of any sort of action. Again, that kind of very loose discretion is something that can be really harmful to the folks that we're working with. Very much in general, lack of access. We have statistics for days on trans and gender nonconforming folks not being able to gain employment, being discriminated against, trying to do an employment discrimination suit by no means is simple or easy. We have a civil unit that focuses on that entirely. So gaining access, continuing to deal and have access to employment, being able to access those services and rights. The Human Rights Administration, folks do have access to public benefits, but I will say almost every single Black trans woman that I have worked with has had an issue at an HRA office, right? Has had an issue with security guards saying they were being hostile for simply enforcing their right to be called by whatever name, affirming name and pronoun matches is them, regardless of what's on a legal ID. Folks who are, when warrants are run, purposely being called by an old legal name, even if they've had legal name changes, simply to harass them, simply to belittle them, which can cause, of course, stress in those moments for folks to have other charges tacked onto them, being aggressive, the various labels that we see happen to folks through the course of arrest, and that lead stops, lead folks just being harassed on the street to being detained to being arrested. I definitely want to turn it over to Mik, but again, the harassment and assault we see through arrest up until arrest is really prevalent. And I'll definitely turn to Mik to talk about incarceration, which again skyrockets in terms of sexual harassment and treatment and issues that folks are facing while incarcerated.
Yeah, I mean, Jazz, I think that was a wonderful overview. One thing I wanted to highlight, just because specifically thinking about the crisis of transfers from Rose to Bedford Hills right now, is what we as advocates, as direct service providers, know about the treatment of transgender men at Bedford Hills, and then what is publicly known about that. So I previous to Legal Aid, worked at Sylvia Rivera Law Project. I was the director of Prisoner Justice, and before that was at Prisoners Legal Services. So I have worked with people at Bedford Hills since about 2013, 2012. And it took a very long time for me to get the trust of the trans men who were there, many of whom are in on very, very long sentences, in part because of how their gender or their sexuality was abused during the trial to make it seem that they are an inconsistent person or a person who cannot be trusted because look at how they waffle between identities. And like so many people who are in women's prisons, a lot of trans men are in on crimes related to domestic violence. And that's really misunderstood for cisgender men and trans men and trans women. It's not even understood enough for cis women, but you add in any kind of other gender difference and how domestic violence factors into that is really misunderstood. So sorry, that's just to say that there are many men in women's prisons, and they often don't reveal themselves to defenders or to appellate advocates or to civil rights people because they have a history of revealing themselves and being ignored or humiliated. Through the time that I've worked with men there, all the Black trans men I've worked with have spent significant time in solitary confinement, some of them up to multiple years. The same can or cannot be said about white or other trans men of color, but it's absolutely true for Black trans men. And a lot of this is, as Jazz was talking about and as Sophie mentioned, like disproportionate relaying of arbitrary laws onto people. So what one person might say is coming out of line, you have to line up all the time, coming out of line, and therefore is a disciplinary error. For another person could just be corrected by saying, get back into line. And these things add up and they add up over time. And I don't know, I think to me, it's a really interesting thing that we are in this place because even right now when we're doing this advocacy between the city and the state about how to correctly house trans, non-binary, intersex, non-conforming people, the thing that is really surprising or very hard for a lot of people in corrections to work with, and I think also to some extent even us on the other side of the divide, is that the best answer is ask your client what they want. And that really runs counter to everything around corrections, absolutely. And then it also sort of in some way runs counter to what we're told as attorneys we should do. And we have to sort of rethink our own wiring around what we think is possible. So like if we have a non-binary client, it might be that we say, well, there's only men's housing and women's housing, so you have to choose. And then forcing us to rethink that and be like, well, how else can we phrase that? How else can we make this possible for them? How do we not just tell them, well, you just have to choose? And how do we actually work with them and fight for not just a better system, a completely different system? And I think that's really what, like when Jazz was talking about the walking while trans law and all that, like that's really where we've seen change happen, is when folks have been supported enough to come forward and share their stories, which makes them very, very vulnerable and makes us question, like, well, why did this law even exist to arrest people before any crime had happened, just for existing in a space? Like, why did that law ever exist? Which I think for a lot of politicians, for a lot of folks in corrections, questioning why a law exists isn't the norm. And so I think as trans people, we have this kind of, there's a possibility perhaps that we can help to question more things. Well, why is that the norm? Why is there men's housing and women's housing? What does that even exist for? So I think personal stories and helping to make it safe for people to share their stories is a huge part of what we can do while we're also doing the direct services and the impact litigation and the policy changes. And that's something that it's been quite a pleasure to work on as well.
Thanks so much for that, Mik, and for lifting up the importance of really listening to the voices and stories of TG and CMBI people who are incarcerated, and how that self-determination is something we should all be working toward. I mean, not even in prison system, because we don't want people in prisons, but just generally speaking. And you had talked about the sort of different prongs with which legal aid is fighting, you know, that it includes this as well as impact litigation and direct services and advocacy. And Erin, I was hoping you could come in and I want to move us along because I do know there's a couple of questions that people have for you all. But can you talk a little bit about the policy end of things in terms of what legal aids work in this arena?
Absolutely, yes. I'm very excited to let people know about the New York Gender Identity, Respect, Dignity, and Safety Act. The slide prior showed that there are some states that have adopted better protections than New York has for trans people, which I think is a real shame, given that we live in a state that really likes to pride itself on being LGBTQ progressive. And on this issue, they need to be shamed into taking action. And this is one way that we can take action. This is a bill, it's very similar to the California bill that passed last year. This bill has not passed. We are very hopeful for this session that it might move, and we're hopeful that this announcement regarding these transfers and the issues it's raised about how TGNC and BI people are treated in the state prison system will create some momentum to really push them to finally do the right thing here. And so this legislation is really trying to do what Mik was talking about. Prisons and jails are supposed to house people based on their gender identity, unless the person says that they would be safer otherwise. So we really want to make sure that this is about where the person believes that they will be safest, and that if they find themselves in a place where they're not safe any longer, or they feel like they would prefer to switch to another facility, where they have the ability to do that. And it's going to really limit the discretion that prison and jail officials have in denying appropriate placement for people. Because as Sophie said, this is the failure of PREA. PREA does not do enough. It lets people say we are doing individualized assessments, when in reality, they're just basically putting in a blanket ban on housing people based on their gender identity, except in extremely unusual circumstances. It also does some things to protect people's ability to access items that are consistent with their gender identity, to be searched by officers most closely aligned with their gender identities, unless, again, they request otherwise. And really important to emphasize the right to medical care and treatment. This is another area where Mik, Sophie, and I are constantly advocating with docs alongside our clients, because they are not getting gender affirming mental health care. They're not getting timely hormone treatments. They're not getting surgeries at all, even though that is a kind of a clear constitutional right that you have to medically necessary care. So this will be another tool that we can use to make sure that we can protect people as much as we possibly can. We're very hopeful, would urge everyone to support this bill. We're so happy to speak more about it at some other point in time, give you information about it so that we can really tell legislators it is past time for New York State to take this step.
Thank you so much, Erin. That's really exciting to hear about this bill. We'll talk a little bit more at closing about the other actions that we can all take. I did want to throw it over to Jazz now. We do, for the questions for the panelists, Jazz is going to help direct specific questions to the legal aid staff person with that particular expertise and knowledge. So Jazz, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. So one of the first questions, I'll go in order. Somebody had asked, what was the rationale behind closing Rosie's? I'm going to direct that to Mik and Erin. Erin, would like to start, actually.
Yeah, happy to start. So this announcement was made in response to this humanitarian crisis, which is extremely serious at Rikers right now, as far as overcrowding. There's been a shocking number of deaths in these facilities recently. COVID, it's truly a humanitarian crisis. And they decided that this was the way to address the crisis. But it's not the way to address the crisis. Of all of the facilities, Rosie, we by no means want to say Rosie's was a great facility, but it functioned a lot better than a lot of the men's jails, that they are not doing anything to address those conditions. So that was the motivating factor, but I think anyone who works in the system intimately does not think that this is the right solution, that it's more of a Band-Aid, and it's a nice thing to announce to the public, but it certainly does not resolve the issue.
Yeah, just to add to that, they keep saying that this move frees up 400 staff members to allow them to go to the other jails. 400 staff is the staff of Rose at the moment. However, we know that all non-citizen individuals, if they've been advocated for on either on their own or by their attorneys, are going to stay. And we know, so cis and trans. And then we all know that any trans, gender nonconforming, non-binary, intersex person who chooses to stay will stay. So there clearly has to be some staff still at Rose. So this number is incorrect. And then in addition, quite honestly, it's making the staff really upset because they don't feel like they should be punished for their colleagues' decisions to not work. So it's actually just going to, in my opinion, not only will it logically not work, I think is going to cause a lot of harm to other people because no one is happy about this.
Thank you. We did receive a question about whether LAS would provide training to law enforcement on pronouns and how to treat trans and TG&C and BI folks. I'm actually going to open that up to the panelists. I know a number of individuals have been part of looking at NYPD training, wanting to comment on it, and I know a number of us have been connected to community advocates who have been a part of trainings that have not had a ton of success. So I actually we'll open that up because I know prisoners' rights, Mik, Erin, and Sophie have been part of some of those conversations and efforts.
I mean, I will say that the NYPD since 2012 has had what some might say are decent on their face policies. And yet 5 years after those policies were adopted, the Department of Investigation released a report that basically none of them had been implemented. And so I think even though training is an important piece of that, it's not the only piece. There has to be a much more kind of radical overhaul of the NYPD culture in order to even come close to making this a more safer space. And so while I'm certainly always interested in talking to law enforcement, talking about how things can improve, I do think there might be better approaches to trying to make it better for our clients, hopefully downsizing the NYPD perhaps altogether.
Thank you. Someone asked earlier, this was actually before we started to talk specifically about folks' rights within carceral systems, but how much agency do trans people get over their housing? For example, could a trans man opt to go to either men's or women's facility? Are there any places where a group of trans people are housed together separate from the cis population? And I can direct that to Erin as well.
I was going to let Mik tackle that one.
Sorry, I was about to say, I'm really excited to tackle this. So this is actually, in part, it's because Legal Aid worked with, oh my goodness, Bronx Defenders, Sylvia Rivera Law Project, many other on-the-ground organizations with DOC back in 2014, well, for many years on this issue, but in 2014, we finally got the Department of Corrections to create a directive for what at the time was called a transgender housing unit. And that unit was specifically a unit for trans women and trans feminine non-binary people. However, it was in a men's jail. It was at MDC, which is the one that's in downtown Manhattan. It's closed now, but at the time it was there. So that was the first trans housing unit. And the idea there was that we would allow trans women who are being housed as men still to at least be with each other and be with officers who had opted into being in that unit and had been specially trained on that unit. So again, sounded okay on paper, not great, but it sounded okay. However, the officers never got the trainings. And they were in an extraordinarily dysfunctional jail that has enormous problems. And they were still, treated as men. And things would happen such as someone would go for a visit, they have to change their outfits to go to the visit. And so a trans woman would have to change her outfit with all the cisgender men. So there was no, they hadn't thought about it beyond the unit. Legal Aid did amazing advocacy on behalf of a client she was fantastic. And she gave her story and her what had happened to her to Legal Aid to use in advocacy, and the unit got moved to Rose M. Singer, the women's jail. So now there was a transgender housing unit at Rose M. Singer, which is just for trans women and for non-binary trans feminine people. They then had to change that to the Special Consideration Unit, which is their new name. And around the time that Layleen Polanco died in Rikers custody from a completely preventable, completely a death that is on their hands, to be honest. They hired an LGBTQIA initiatives director. And that person has really fought against the system, I would say, while still being in it, has fought against the system to help make this a little bit more transparent. So yes, the short answer is a trans man any trans person, any gender nonconforming intersex trans person can say, this is where I feel safest to be housed. And that should be given special consideration when the DOC makes their housing decision. Now, what happens at that point is really actually quite vague for us, because all of their documents on this are all internal, and even me on this city council appointed thing, I'm not allowed to see them either. So no one has seen them, no one knows about them. So we don't know how these final determinations are made, and it seems to be like what Erin was saying, is just a blanket ban. But yes, so like, for example, if I was arrested as a trans man, I could say, I actually would like to be at Rose, please. And then once I got to Rose, and under today's conditions, I could also then say, don't transfer me up to Bedford Hills, I'd like to stay at Rose. That said, these are, that's only if they listen to me. It's not guaranteed. It's not, and it's only if I happen to know that. It's only if my lawyers have told me that. It's only if I happen to have been approached by one of the LGBT liaisons, which is a staff of 5 people, and been told this. So there are rights there. We're working on getting them even better, but a lot of it has to do with lack of access and lack of resources, and people being told contradictory things in order to scare them.
And I think what Mik has described is really applicable to Rikers, and it's why when we say that Rikers is slightly less discriminatory than the state system, it's because the state system, there's really very little agency. The process to try to get an individualized assessment to be housed consistent with your gender identity is long. Nobody really understands how they're making the decision. It's extremely invasive. There's really no way to challenge it, and the vast majority of them are rejected. And so the question about agency, I think, especially in the state system, there really is very little. You can say what you want, but the vast majority of trans women are still housed in men's prisons in our state prison system, which is shocking and terrible that this is where we are today.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Judy Yu. Thank you, everyone, for answering questions and for sending questions. If there are lingering unanswered questions, we will definitely find a way to send answers out to folks that joined. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all. I'm sorry, this hour really just flew by. And like Jazz said, we will follow up. I think there may have been 1 or 2 questions that we didn't get to, but we will follow up by email. But I want to just really thank every single panelist for sharing their wisdom, their knowledge, their passion with all of us today, and really informing us about the current issues and landscape for TGNC MBI people in New York, especially as it relates to the criminal legal system. And I really want to urge all of us who were on this webinar as part of the Trans Day of Remembrance Week to take action. And there are many ways that we can all help. First and foremost, let me just say, please support the work by a donation. This work cannot happen without that. There is a link being shared in the chat to donate, but we will also be sharing it in a follow-up email. Then the other action we can all take is to, and actually before we go into that, I want to just make a special call out to any institutional funders who were joining us today, that I am more than happy to also talk to you about why Wellspring Philanthropic Fund supported Legal Aid Society for 10 plus years, and why we believe in their work. So please follow up with Aisha, if you would like my contact info, I'm happy to talk to you. And then for all of us, we can take action by when the Gender Identity, Respect, Dignity, and Safety Act is complete, we can call our assembly person, our state representatives, and urge them to support this critical bill. And just generally in our day-to-day lives, let's all be advocates. Let's educate one another. Let's really share this message that we heard today on social media. I know Legal Aid Society will be putting out content from this on social media as well. And again, all the links that you see on the screen right now will be shared in a follow-up email. You can also, of course, volunteer with Legal Aid Society, and there's a link there if you want to get more deeply involved. So thank you so much for coming. And I really hope that we will all take action to paraphrase that, I think Mother Jones saying, right, to honor the dead and fight like hell for the living. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.